ごめん。ダメやった。
When talking about a show that has captured the hearts of audiences everywhere, I find myself at a difficult crossroad. At first, I immediately found myself attached to this relatable uphill battle of a young man learning to feel confident in his own abilities, through the love he feels for the sport he's dedicated himself to, and later for the very person who inadvertently placed him on that path to begin with. Maybe it's because I find myself plagued with those very same mental shackles of never being good enough in the eyes of those that I love, even now as I write this script. But just seeing someone actually come out on the other side of that struggle better than they ever have been before is enough to make one feel that everything will be okay, if only for a moment. You could tell that Sayo Yamamoto, the show's director and main storyboard writer, saw the potential in taking what many would consider a tired narrative and portray it through the art of figure skating, exemplified by her previous work in Endless Night. I must admit, it's interesting looking at this animated short as more of an unofficial pilot in retrospect, albeit one that tells a similar story in a much simpler way. And while the magic admittedly begins to fade at times, as evident by the animation's diminishing frames, the director's efforts mostly shine through, capturing an almost euphoric yet wholly personal experience in one continuously well-choreographed sequence. Working under Studio Mappa, you could tell that Yamamoto did everything in her power to recreate that experience for Yuri on Ice, going so far as to ask retired figure skater and now choreographer Kenji Miyamoto to work on the show's skating sequences. It's just a shame that such passions would later prove to be incompatible with the very nature of a full Japanese television production.
You will be skating to Yuri on Ice.
Now, arguably the first place Yuri on Ice begins to lose me is with the show's blatant reuse of animation as a crutch. And while many would just consider this as a necessary evil, as is the case with most standardized television anime, it doesn't change the fact that constant exposure to the same exact scenes with little to no variety made any other issues I would have had all the more prevalent. The production staff would start by recording Kenji's routines on the ice and generate a 3D model as a base for the animators to trace over, a technique that's often implemented when it comes to animating specific sequences that need to display rapid, complex movement in a realistic way. However, because the staff didn't have enough time to keep up with the fast, minute movements of the choreography, their desire for constant fluid motion actually came at the expense of realistic human anatomy. When the animation properly incorporates the characters' torsos, the skating sequences can be absolutely captivating, since the way the pelvis moves is essential when it comes to portraying natural human movement. But when the uncorrected drawings are at their worst, they can turn scenes that are meant to be perceived as a beautiful spectacle, and turn them into an awkward mess. The lack of frames during spins, for example, can come off as unintentionally choppy, and when the rest of the character's limbs become overly thin or elongated, other appendages tend to get lost in the scuffle, preventing the beautifully detailed clothing, which was designed by real pro skating costume designers, from being fully appreciated in motion. If the animators took full advantage of the skating rink's size and went for more distant shots, then the noticeable lack of detail and motion exaggeration could have been more acceptable. However, because barely any of the performances seemed to have actually required that, almost everything was just laid awkwardly bare in the foreground. By playing with such compromising camera angles, the warped perspectives made it easy to question whether or not the characters were even on the ice at all, and very few jumps felt like they had any real weight behind them on account of the unreliable physics. There was even a pivotal turning point early on in the series where Victor decided for Yuri to focus more on his artistic side rather than his jumps, which might have been a great creative decision made on the staff's end. It would have given them the chance to play around with more experimental animation during the stepping sequences and lean towards a more detailed artistic approach, instead of going with programs that are more jump intensive. However, this meant that the animators would have been put under an enormous strain, which might also explain why this narrative decision never really went that far, for those of you that happen to notice.
みんながイメージすることの真逆をしなきゃびっくりしないだろう？俺のモットーだ。っていうか。
I'll be the first to admit that the depiction of activities with constant motion in TV anime have always been an issue that tends to require some sort of compromise. But when that compromise comes at the expense of the activity's very essence, then my appreciation can only go so far, creating a rift between me and the anime from meeting on the same page. There are very few things more depressing than watching one art form mangle another, especially when both have the potential for supplementation. When we look at shows that put such a strong emphasis on a specific mode of artistry, we can respect any and all attention to detail just as much as the literal narrative, because they help create the impression that those professions extend beyond the bounds of fiction. That way, the story feels like there's a bigger scale because what we're seeing is only a small fraction of the infinite possibilities readily made available. As I hope many people can imagine, figure skating is an expressive sport, perhaps the most out of all the athletics to the point where it transcends into its own specific art form. It's a performance piece that requires the cooperation of both the small and large muscles of the body to bring out every minute emotion of both the music and the skater, a dance that represents the physical prowess disguised with the sensitivity and artistic beauty through their interpretation. In Yuri on Ice's case, despite trying so hard to make sure that the average viewer is kept up to speed with the nuances of the sport on a professional level, the actual figure skating itself doesn't really entice that sense of intimate communication, even though everything else from the dialogue to the spot-on vocal performances lead us to believe otherwise.
今回のプログラムだって、僕には物語が浮かび上がって見えたんだ。
Even the diverse OST, which has been constantly praised for its various tempos and genres, only serves to further this illusion, despite the fact that everyone is moving at roughly the exact same speed. In real life, every small mannerism of the athlete is magnified as soon as they hit the ice, to the point where any feelings of nervousness or disappointment in their own program become clear as day, which is also why everyone remains silent once the program starts. But when you get rid of those subtle nuances and try to supplement them through constant commentary or interjecting flashbacks, I feel like we as an audience end up missing out on an integral chunk of the immersion factor. And the sad part is, I'm not even 100% sure what could have been done to mitigate all of these shortcomings. For example, the staff could have skipped the use of 3D models completely and simply rotoscoped the actual live-action footage they used as a reference, a technique that the studio actually implemented near flawlessly in some of their earlier work's more complicated scenes. But while that might have made the character's anatomy more on model during the performances, it could have also potentially been just as physically demanding for everyone involved, if not more so. And while some of the show's technical mistakes will more than likely be fixed when the show comes out on Blu-ray, considering the sheer amount of course correcting already done when the show was airing on different platforms, it's highly doubtful all the mistakes can even be fully corrected unless redrawn from scratch. It's easy for one to find fault with what could easily be considered a personal quandary as I sit here overanalyzing things that most people don't think about.
絶対ビクトルも深く考えてないって。ビクトルは天才だからそれでも成り立つんだよ。
However, in a show that celebrates the fact that there's no single way that love can be conveyed to the world, it hurts when I see someone unable to fully express theirs. Some people like to think that love is all about glorifying the good and ignoring all that which can potentially harm that ideal. To me, love is about accepting something in spite of its faults, being nurturing yet firm, and always acknowledging the potential that's brimming at the seams. I could call Yuri on Ice insightful, heartfelt, and emotionally uplifting, as it sets that example we ourselves might not feel we're worthy of. But after voicing these grievances, I can only wonder if the thoughts of others will be as flippant as mine have been. Regardless, all I can do now is look toward the future, longing for the day when the staff will be given the opportunity to go beyond that high bar they've set for themselves, and truly make history.